Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's This Is CDR. We're very excited about our session today and very pleased to have you here with us and joining us. Just some quick background. This is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals. OpenAir seeks to advance at every level of government in the U.S., as well as national and subnational jurisdictions locally. Quick background on OpenAir. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. We're a global community growing quickly, and we collaborate on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, R&D, and activist CDR market development. There should be a link in the chat to sign up for our group, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. My name is Toby Bryce, normally based in Brooklyn, New York. Zooming in today from San Francisco. Before we get started, we always like to define the terms that we're using, and this definition of carbon removal comes from the CDR primer and is essentially also the same definition that the IPCC uses. Purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. Two quick things that are important to call out when we talk about carbon removal. Number one, carbon removal is different from what is commonly called carbon capture, which typically refers to point source carbon capture, meaning capturing CO2 from an emission source, whether it's a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. This may or may not be a good climate solution depending on the circumstance, but one thing it's definitely not is carbon removal. Again, carbon removal is removing CO2 from the atmosphere and durably storing it. Number two, it's really important, and everyone in the carbon removal sector, I think, is pretty aligned on this, but it's really important to call out that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing emissions. We need to reduce emissions as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal will be required at gigaton scale by mid-century. That's billions of tons per year, because we're not going to be able to reduce all of our emissions in a climate relevant timeframe. For example, the agricultural sector, the food systems, which account for approximately a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, we're not going to be able to eliminate all of those emissions in a climate relevant timeframe. So we need to reduce emissions as quickly and as completely as possible, but we need to walk and chew gum at the same time and also be scaling up carbon removal. Our current scale is tens of thousands of tons per year, and we need to get to billions of tons per year by mid-century. So we need to get to work on this. And today we're going to talk about another really important factor is we need to do it in a very equitable way. We have this chance to build a new industry, and we have a chance to do it right. So look forward to learning about that today. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Megha Raghavan, who will talk a little bit about Round of Show and then introduce today's speakers.
Hi everyone, I'm Megha Raghavan. I'm an OpenAir member based in London, and I work on CDR policy advocacy. Usual housekeeping notes, so our format will be a quick presentation followed by a few moderated questions from Toby, and then we'll have some audience Q&A. So please type any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box. Just note that that's separate from the chat function, so be sure to find the right one. It helps us to organize and sort of make sure we get to as many as possible. The event is being recorded, so we'll send the video link out to all of you who registered, and we will post it to OpenAir's website and our YouTube channel. This week on This Is CDR, we're very pleased to welcome Celina Scott-Buechler from Data for Progress and Dr. Simone H. Stewart from the National Wildlife Federation to present their important recent work on charting a path to Just DAC Hubs. Celina Scott-Buechler is the Senior Resident Fellow for Climate Innovation at Data for Progress, or DFP, where she leads their growing work on progressive carbon removal solutions, removing gigatons of past greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere by developing equitable, community beneficial, and environmental justice-centered strategies. Celina has worked as a legislative staffer for Senator Cory Booker, as a policy director for the Center for Environmental Peacebuilding, and a consultant to the UN. She's currently the co-chair of the research consortium Ocean Vision's Marine Circular Bioeconomy Task Force and serves on the board of directors of the Telluride Association as an education democracy nonprofit. Celina is also pursuing a PhD in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program for the Environment and Resources at the Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. She graduated summa cum laude from the Honors College Scholars Program at Cornell University, where she also earned her master's in atmospheric science. Dr. Simone H. Stewart currently works as the Industry Policy Specialist on NWF's Climate and Energy Policy Program team with a portfolio focused on carbon capture, utilization and storage, carbon dioxide removal technologies, and other strategies to aid in a just green transition for difficult to decarbonize sectors such as energy and industry. She's a published researcher in the field of fluid mechanics and earned a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. At UCSB, her research focused on investigating the fluid mechanics of fluxes over rough surfaces with application in large-scale direct air carbon capture and clean energy architecture. During that time, she also worked as the graduate assistant for the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, where she led a variety of programming, created detailed information campaigns centered around justice, community enfranchisement, and helped develop a comprehensive People's Guide to the Green New Deal rooted in the tenets of environmental and economic justice. So Celina and Simone, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will share my screen here and we can just dive in. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Simone and I have been working closely together to try and figure out how the direct air capture hubs, pot of funding that we'll talk about in a minute, can be implemented in ways that are just, equitable, and that advance environmental justice without working against it. So I'll pass it over to Simone and we can kick it off.
Thank you, Celina, for kicking it off. As Celina said, we're really interested in the intersection between carbon removal strategies, specifically in this reference frame, direct air capture hubs and environmental justice. And just as Celina said, how we can, marry the two of them and make sure that they're working in cohesion with each other. And so I think to kind of set the lay of the land, just as Toby did at the beginning of this presentation, I think it's really important to discuss what we mean when we say environmental justice. And it's kind of a bit of a dichotomy, because I think that we should work to define environmental justice, but at the same time, I'll start by saying that there isn't a universal or recognized definition of environmental justice. So it is kind of something that really should be defined by communities themselves, communities that are facing disenfranchisement and injustice. And so up on this very text-heavy slide, I do have the US EPA definition, which is what a lot of people in the private sector and the public sector are used to using when discussing environmental justice. And so this definition, it's kind of set up like other definitions where we're talking about the fair treatment, and in this case, meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, and other identifiers of an environmental justice community. And so I highlight this specific definition because of the use regardless. I think oftentimes people take issue with the fact that regardless is used in this context as if it's saying that everything that comes after is slightly less important. So, we want people to participate regardless of who they are. But what's really important in the context of environmental justice is those identifying factors. And so I've also shared this other, a bit longer definition by Dr. Bunyan Bryant, a quote from him. He's an EJ pioneer and he is also from Flint, Michigan. And so I find this definition a little bit more comprehensive, even though it is a bit more detailed. So it references cultural norms, values, rules, behaviors that are involved in these communities that link people together. And so he says that environmental justice is served when people can realize their highest potential. And so I really like this definition, especially within the context of what we'll be discussing today, because as Celina and I have both written in the memo that we're basing this presentation off of, we really think that DAC has potential to be useful as a carbon dioxide removal technology and a strategy for fighting the climate crisis. And so I think today we'll talk a little bit more about that potential, but recognizing that all people, communities that will host DAC, communities that will benefit from it, should be able to reach their highest potential as people. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is just that the 17 principles of environmental justice were created in 1991 at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And so these principles often lay the foundation groundwork for many nonprofits that do EJ-centered work. So thanks, Celina. You can go to the next slide. So now that we've talked a little bit about how we define and can't define environmental justice, I think it's really important that we discuss the practice of environmental justice and why it's important in this space. And so environmental justice has become kind of a new buzzword, especially in the carbon dioxide removal space, because this is a growing sector and we're seeing it grow very rapidly, as Celina will get into in a few minutes. But in order to understand how to enact environmental justice, I think that we, think of environmental justice as a noun, but it's also a verb, that we should be practicing this. We have to understand that the crux of environmental justice is that injustice exists. And in many presentations, I've kind of started with this note because I think it is really important for everybody in the CDR ecosystem, whether you're a project developer, whether you're an analyst, or you're a data scientist, or you're a community member, to understand, recognize, acknowledge that injustice is fundamental to the way that our society functions. And so in order to foster this work, we have to acknowledge that fighting injustice is inherent to combating climate change and the climate crisis, because there are certain groups that are experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis more so than other groups. And that is because injustice exists in our society. And so the climate crisis is often referred to as a threat multiplier. And so this means that if you are a part of a demographic that is already experiencing some type of injustice, whether it's social, whether it's economic, you are more likely to experience the threats of climate change. And so as we investigate this pathway of trying to understand how to enact justice, it's really important for us to think about some questions. So I have a couple posted, like, where does injustice come from? What causes it? Who perpetuates it? Who benefits from it? And so I liken a lot of times discussing environmental justice to personal anti-racism journeys, that this is something that all of us in this ecosystem have to be confronting in order to really understand how we can enact justice. And so, I've listed some of the groups that are in the United States face major climate crisis threats. Those groups include low income or socioeconomic status, minorities, and older and elderly populations. So now that we kind of have a foundation about what environmental justice is, why it's really important in the context of the climate crisis, I'll throw it to Celina to talk a little bit more about the DAC hubs themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. A great kind of context for having this conversation. And as Simone and Toby have modeled, defining our terms is extremely, extremely important. I imagine that folks on this call probably already know this, but to just talk about sort of what this webinar is on. So here we're talking specifically about direct air capture. Those who have been following the kind of winding path of the DAC hubs know that there has been some ambiguity about whether DOE is allowed to award these funds just to direct air capture itself or to kind of, a more expansive set of technologies. But for the purposes of this webinar, we'll just be talking about direct air capture. And so what is direct air capture? It is broadly an infrastructure-based approach that removes CO2 from the ambient or open air using a filter, usually a sorbent or a solvent, and usually, driving large volumes of air through that in order to kind of selectively bind the CO2. When we're talking about carbon dioxide removal, the CO2 is either, stored deep underground via mineralization or in saline aquifers or other geologic reservoirs, or in long-lived products. And this is slightly different from use, where CO2 can be used in a variety of ways where it's not intended to be permanently removed from the atmosphere. So you can think about fuels or other kind of, short-lived products where that CO2 will end up back into the atmosphere. But as we probably also already know, direct air capture has a number of different kind of project components that make it up. And so one of the things that we've sort of been investigating is not just how do we approach direct air capture as a whole, but how can we be more specific about the various pieces that make up direct air capture and address those piece by piece. So first, to kind of, set the scene, how do voters feel about carbon dioxide removal broadly? Luckily, we're sort of working with an audience that doesn't know very much about carbon removal yet. And so when they are presented with information on carbon dioxide removal and potential policies, including those that Open Air has been instrumental in pushing for at state and federal levels, there's bipartisan support, which is really exciting. However, our research shows that this bipartisan support is sort of, tenuous, right? Folks are waiting to see what large scale examples of carbon removal will look like in order to form opinions. So we're starting off on a really great footing. And also there's a lot of work to be done in order to kind of, provide those proofs of concept for successful and equitable direct carbon dioxide removal broadly, of which direct air capture is one example. So going specifically into the policies that we're talking about. So in the past kind of year plus, we've seen a lot of investment and excitement in direct air capture at the legislative level. So most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act took the 45Q tax credit and upped those tax credits for direct air capture, both for geologic storage, which has a kind of, premium price on it, also for, CO2 utilization, which is slightly lower, and then also enhanced oil recovery. And before that, and the kind of bulk of what our conversation today will focus on is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which allocated $3.5 billion, the single largest investment in direct air capture by a national government, in order to create 4 regional hubs. And what are hubs? Well, a little ill-defined, but the idea is to have the infrastructure for capture, for storage, and for the transportation in between those two places, sort of generally in the same area, and to build out that infrastructure such that it is connective. There was also a pre-commercial prize competition that was set out for $15 million and a commercial prize for $100 million. And then also working on not just sort of, the hubs themselves, but figuring out how do we connect these regional hubs and or other existing infrastructure for CO2 transportation and storage, and setting aside almost $5 billion for that. And Congress, while sort of unspecific about what it meant by direct air capture and what it meant by hubs, did set aside a few criteria for what it wanted in terms of the siting of these projects. So they said, we want there to be viable CO2 storage opportunities. That makes a lot of sense, especially if you're putting a premium on storing the CO2 for long periods of time. We want there to be low carbon intensity electricity so that you can kind of plug into existing energy sources that you then might have to expand out because direct air capture is quite energy intensive, but at least you're, starting at a decent point. And we want there to be kind of an ongoing presence of oil and gas such that there is the possibility for sort of a just transition. And the final, or really the first criterion that they set out was that we want these hubs to be prioritized in economic opportunity zones. What are economic opportunity zones? It's a tax classification where they're, low income communities, and read generously, this can be seen as an opportunity to match economic investment with economic need in communities that have been traditionally underinvested in. Read a bit more cynically, you can see Congress kind of setting aside new infrastructure projects in a new sector in communities that have traditionally borne the brunt of infrastructure build out, right? And so the kind of, goal of the work that Simone and I put together is how do we capitalize on that first interpretation? How do we make sure that this is an opportunity for sort of a just transition where communities are centered and economic opportunity is spread to the areas where not only it is needed, but also where it is wanted in this particular form? So Data for Progress does a lot of kind of public polling at the national level. And so we tried to kind of figure out what generally are folks looking for in direct air capture hubs, and how then can we kind of, disaggregate, again, as I was saying, direct air capture as a broad concept into its various components. And so we ran a national conjoint survey, which is essentially, a random generation of 2 policy packages of a direct air capture hub. And respondents are then asked, which would you prefer, not just kind of, somewhere in the US, but in your community, right? Personalize this, ask, what are you looking for in these kinds of projects? And although the funding is already set aside, we also asked about funding source. How would you want these kinds of policies to be funded in the future? And we were then not only able to extrapolate the optimal package, what folks wanted to see, but also the relative importance of each one of these variables. And we found that even though, for DAC hubs, funding source is not an open question because it's already been set aside, the funding source was the most important component in determining people's support for a project in their backyards, right? Again, not something that's sort of, somewhere else and they don't have to interact with, but in their backyards. Job creation was the second most important piece that folks identified. And then looking to kind of how are project developers reinvesting project costs into the community via something like a community benefit agreement or something like that. And the optimal package that we found was that this would be funded by a tax on pollutive industries. So this kind of, adheres to a polluter pays principle, that the project developer and owner would be a cooperative enterprise between local businesses, community organizations with a developer, that it would be renewably powered, that community members would have direct voting power over project decisions, not just sort of engaged in the initial stages, but engaged in an ongoing fashion through project implementation. We're looking a bit more into the CO2 storage and transportation. We found some kind of conflicting results on this, but essentially there was overall a preference either for CO2 to be mineralized or else to be transported outside of the community, kind of conceived of probably as a waste product. The highest amount of project costs reinvested in the community, and a long-term jobs guarantee with a unionization commitment. And so kind of, what we've been sort of thinking about is taking a project planning process that looks like this of, identifying a site, permitting for that site, designing the project, then consulting the community, especially if the permitting process requires that, and then moving into hiring for the project. And instead conceiving of a project process that looks like this, of identifying multiple different sites as Carbon 180 laid out in their great mapping project, where the various criteria overlap for a potential project, beginning to consult the communities who live there already, and going through an iterative process of co-designing and building out the workforce for a potential project, all then leading into a permitting process that then hopefully goes by much more easily because there is already community buy-in. So I'll pass it over to Simone to talk through sort of our top line findings on do's and don'ts for deploying direct air capture.
the understanding of where environmental justice fits into this, and then with a lot of the polling work and the data collection that Celina just presented, really trying to, like we said at the beginning, marry these two things to come up with some of our recommendations for DOE as they go forward with the DAC Hubs project. So firstly, we'll start with the don'ts. And so basically what came out of the findings was that, you know, at the top, these projects should do no harm. And if possible, they should really strive not to perpetuate any existing environmental injustices. And so ways that we recommend to do that, Celina just talked about the reevaluating the way that we go through project development itself and coming up with better ways to do that integrate community buy-in and integrate community concerns from the get-go. So we're able to address those needs as they arise. So we also recommend the use of comprehensive screening tools like the EPA's EJ screen, and rejecting proposals outright that have no plans for community engagement. So as Celina said, you know, this has been a historic investment globally in direct air capture. And so DOE has really been intentional so far, putting forward requirements for community engagement and the creation of community benefit agreements and different models for what that engagement can look like. And then, you know, really not assuming that communities are interested in hosting DAC. I think that as we try to expand this sector and build it out, there is kind of an assumption that, well, this is good for the climate, so of course communities want this. And we have to try to kind of break those ideas apart. We have a larger understanding from the science to know that this is what's good for the climate and how to combat the climate crisis, but we can't say that that trumps the real life, you know, experiences of people that are living in these communities that are often already marginalized, already disenfranchised, as Celina mentioned earlier. And so, you know, being able to take a no for project developers, being able to say that we don't want DAC here, if that's what a community decides that they want, respecting that decision. Also, we recommended that the deployment of DAC should not perpetuate fossil fuel use. One of the requirements for DOE is that 2 of the hubs be in these, you know, economically disenfranchised areas. And oftentimes they are that way because we're moving away from this transition outside of fossil fuels to other sources of renewable and clean energy. And so in the same vein, we have to think about how to deploy DAC, which is, as Celina said, very energy intensive in a way that is not going to perpetuate the fossil fuel use and also the hold that fossil fuels as an industry have on these communities. And so what that might look like is committing to using zero carbon energy sources to power the DAC hubs and deprioritizing projects that provide CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And also really looking at a multi-round development track to support innovation. So CDR right now, the most kind of popular form, the most developed form is DAC, but we're hoping that, you know, the DAC that we understand now is going to continue to develop. Innovators will continue to arise. So we want to make sure that, you know, incumbents in this area who are oftentimes fossil fuel industry components are not necessarily dominating this track towards DAC, but that we're allowing for innovation to develop. We're allowing for new ideas to spring forth. Next slide. So we got a little bit deeper into what DAC should do. And this kind of ties back to what I was saying at the beginning, that we believe that DAC has a lot of potential to do good for the climate and also do good for communities if implemented correctly. And so one of the highest principles that we agreed on was aligning with the President's Justice 40 initiative. So this initiative says that 40% of federal investments in climate and energy should flow to disadvantaged communities. So you know, the Justice 40 task force at the White House is working on defining what a disadvantaged community looks like, but they've recommended using, once again, those tools like EJ Screen or CEQ's Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool to really hone in on where these communities exist and what problems already exist within these communities. It's also really important to consult with the stakeholders themselves at all levels, from the local to the state level to the federal level, to really understand and assess what benefits are. The benefits that a project developer may see are maybe not the same benefits that a community wants or thinks that they deserve. So it's really important to consult directly with those who will be affected to determine what these benefits are. I also would like to point out that I thought when Celina first shared her information with me about the polling that they did, that it was really interesting that people said 20% was what they expected to be reinvested into the communities. And so I think, you know, if we can align with the Justice 40 initiative and reinvest 40% of the benefits from these programs back into communities that really meets what they think is their bottom line as their needs and does even more to go beyond that. Continually in the vein of prioritizing community needs, that they should be a part of this decision-making process. It should be a co-created process with communities. We all have a lot more stake in a group project that we're getting a grade on compared to a project that maybe we won't get a grade on that we're not a part of. So we take pride in the things that we do and the work that we do together. And this is the same for when communities are a part of something. So that might look like community benefit agreements, project labor agreements, as Celina pointed out, and the data in the last couple of slides, that jobs creation is really important, but it's also really important to people that they have stable and long-term jobs and that they have unionized jobs. So what does that look like from a project development standpoint, and how can you incorporate those tenets that will hopefully bring justice to these communities into the project development stages? And then also engaging in listening sessions, working on public education, partnering with organizations like National Wildlife Federation, like Data for Progress, organizations that are doing this advocacy work to really understand the lay of the land when you go into a community. Go to the next slide. And the last two tenets that we decided on were valuing quality over expediency. And this is one that I have a lot of conversations about. And I know Celina and I have even talked about this, where we recognize that there is kind of this timeline that the Hill moves on. So we have this federal timeline of approving money, of deciding where the money is going, putting it in different buckets. And then communities have a very different timeline that, is based off of their reality and their lived experiences. And oftentimes these timelines don't match up. So how can we figure out how to take this money that is, has been put in these pots, move it out the door? We recognize that there is a ticking clock with the climate crisis, but that doesn't mean that that we're going to be sloppy about what we do. We still have to meet the values and, the important parts of the community process. And I think that really this idea that community engagement is this added sort of thing that I have to do because DOE has said so is the wrong frame of reference that companies, developers, anybody in this conversation should have. As an engineer, we kind of are given the message of measure twice, cut once. So you want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence at the start of a project so that project can be successful all the way through. And that looks like having community engagement. That looks like prioritizing community's values and concerns in the project development stage. So we know that the hubs, with all of the money backed behind them, with the kind of public outcry around technological solutions and the climate crisis, that they've been highly scrutinized. So we kind of have, an opportunity to meet this moment and to do it correctly, because it will set the tone for what people think of CDR and DAC moving forward. And so that looks like, being powered by non-fossil energy, pairing the DAC hubs with high quality monitoring and verification, and then communicating that transparently with communities, and linking this with permanent geological storage, because that is really the best way that we're going to really remove CO2 from the atmosphere and combat the global temperature rise. And lastly, we hope that the recommendations will inspire Congress to clarify the role of DAC and therefore CDR in a larger landscape should play in climate action. A lot of the concerns that people have is that focusing really on removal means that we stop focusing on decarbonization, we stop focusing on mitigation. And that just isn't true. And it's not a successful way for any of this to work. The only way that CDR can be deployed is in cohesion with mitigation and cohesion with decarbonization. And so it's up to Congress to really dictate the clear definitions for these things and the timelines for each of them. So I've kind of gone through our recommendations that we discussed in the memo, so I'll throw it to Celina to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. So as Simone laid out, we are now at a critical point for these technologies, not just, direct air capture itself, but direct air capture kind of as representative of CDR as a whole. And it is crucial that the Department of Energy take this opportunity to center equitable development of new infrastructure in ways that rewrite the role of the fossil fuel industry and, most importantly, meet the needs of the communities most vulnerable to the climate crisis. And that is both through potential project development, but also the right of refusal to project development. we should all want justice as much as we want carbon dioxide removal, and we should deliver on both. And hopefully these recommendations that we've laid out allow us to both move swiftly on the climate crisis and develop these much needed technologies without sacrificing justice and equity as we do so. So with that, I will close us out, and we're happy for any questions. Thanks.
Thanks to you both. That was really an excellent and articulate presentation. I was listening to Celina's podcast with a friend of Open Air, Naeem, that was posted a couple weeks ago, and that you were talking about how there's no playbook for carbon removal companies and how they deal with these issues. But I feel like you are presenting a playbook, which I think is super valuable. So thank you for that. Before we dig into specific questions, can you both talk to us a little bit and tell the audience about your personal journey to where you are now and kind of how you got into climate and how you started getting interested in working on CDR? Whoever wants to go first.
I can take it first. I've had kind of an interesting journey. I think I work for the National Wildlife Federation, as was said earlier. And as you can imagine, there's not that many engineers who work for the National Wildlife Federation. And so really for me, I had always loved physics and engineering, and I knew that I wanted to be an engineer to problem solve. And the climate crisis was always something that was really interesting to me because it's really a thread that touches everyone globally. And so finding ways to combat this crisis, especially to help marginalized and disenfranchised communities and people who looked like me, was always really important to me. And so I pursued a PhD in mechanical engineering, and I joined a lab that was really focused on wind energy. And so I was just really always seeing the ways that engineering could be interactive with climate justice. But really the justice part was a little bit more difficult to find. As you can imagine, a PhD in engineering is a very hardcore kind of like pigeonholed environment where the expectations are that you will do research, that you will publish papers, and that you will, find new data. And so I felt like it was really lacking the human component, ironically, even though as engineers, we were developing these solutions to help society. And so that was why I worked during graduate school at the Blum Center at UCSB, which is our Center for Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy. And the theme for the 2 years that I was there was the Green New Deal. And so I really worked with my boss to have a conversation about how engineering can be leveraged with other interdisciplinary conversations to really discuss the role that technology should play in combating the climate crisis. And so I really felt like that brought a lot of value and personal pride to my work. So I wanted to find a way to pursue that intersection further when I graduated with my PhD. And that really led me to the National Wildlife Federation because they were launching a new job, which was the industrial policy specialist last year, because they were continually inundated with requests to engage in the carbon management sphere as an organization that had a historical conservation perspective. And so that was it was a really great marriage of qualification and timing with that job. And so, I'm really happy to continue building out NWF's platform on carbon management and industrial decarbonization.
Yeah, and I came to this both kind of out of desperation, but also out of skepticism. I studied coral bleaching for a number of years and was working with coastal communities, artisanal fishery communities that relied on fisheries supported by coral reefs in order to, earn a living and to feed their families. And watching the precipitous decline of coral reefs and feeling that my role in research and advocacy was to slow the eventual decline of this beautiful ecosystem that I'd come to love and all of the communities that then relied on it was really saddening, and was not something that felt like I could, personally sustain myself in. I have so much respect for the folks who are still, working on these ecosystems and on this work. I think that's going to be extremely, extremely important. And there are some glimmers of hope in coral ecology in the past year. So, not all is lost. But that coincided with kind of the release of the special report on 1.5. And this was sort of my first introduction to carbon dioxide removal. And I read into it immediately, sort of a moral hazard, like, the potential to distract from decarbonization, was highly, highly skeptical, but was also sort of looking around the room and saying, there are a lot of technical experts in this field who obviously know what they're talking about, but there aren't a whole lot of policy voices that are trying to do this right. And in the past couple of years, that number has certainly grown, which is really, really great. But that was sort of my entry into this field, was how can we do something that is sort of forward-looking, that is, hopeful and inspiring, but how can we make sure that we do it right in ways that don't distract from the critical work at hand, which is decarbonization. And so that's sort of the balance that I try to strike in my work, as I think, most folks do, which is, again, really uplifting. The field has changed a lot in the past couple of years, which is really great to see. Toby, you're muted. And
I'm muted, telling Toby he's muted.
Sorry, my bad. I'm mainly asking this question because I want to highlight the amazing polling that DFP did about the New York CDRLA. And I put that link in the chat. It's actually not the raw data, but the semi-raw data, I think it's really well done. And can you talk a little bit about how something like that works, how you go about doing it, and what was striking to you about those results because I think that's some of the first CDR polling that DFP did. And they were striking to me, but tell us about how you went about doing it and kind of what you thought about it.
Yeah, definitely. So we conducted polling both at the New York State level and also at the federal level. So there's a, CDR Leadership Act, both in New York State and at the federal level. They're slightly different, but sort of evolutions of kind of the same idea. And we wanted to figure out sort of, we had done initial baseline polling. How do voters think about CDR sort of in the abstract? And found that there was generally bipartisan support, again, from sort of, a position of not knowing a whole lot and sort of misidentifying some of the things that do constitute CDR. And so, that there's a lot of work to be done on sort of educating the public and creating those narratives. But we wanted to see, okay, if the government were to try and put money toward this idea in kind of a big way, would we see similar levels of support? Kind of, again, when we asked folks about what is the most important piece of a direct air capture hub, folks identified funding, right? Like there's kind of an ongoing trend in policy of the thing that voters usually care most about is sort of, is it going to impact them financially? And what are sort of, the questions of fairness around that? And so we asked at the New York State level, how do you feel about the state government deploying or passing policy that would create this system of, funding CDR? And folks said, yep, that sounds good. And with kind of a slight bump among Democrats, who are usually more climate driven in their voting preferences, but across the board, high levels of support that we often do not see in climate issues. So that's really, really exciting. There is bipartisan support where there isn't for other climate issues. And the piece of it that was most interesting to me is that there was a bump in voter approval when they learned that the policy would be funded by closing a loophole in, taxes for pollutive industries. And that then inspired this question that we put on this conjoint poll of how do you want these kinds of policies to be funded? I think often we think about implementation, and we've been talking a lot about implementation here, and that is going to be extremely, extremely important. And also there are questions of equity and fairness at sort of the top line policy level of we are essentially dealing with a waste problem that has been disproportionately created by a select few industries. And how now do we figure out how to pay for this, relatively expensive service without disadvantaging and putting the costs on folks who have contributed least to the problem.
Fantastic. Simone, any comment? Or it's more of a DFP question. We have a ton of audience questions and I want to get to them. So I'm going to cut my bit short here, but just one quick fire question for each of you last. Simone, what are your 3 biggest concerns about how the DAC hubs will be rolled out or implemented? 2 or 3 or 1.
My biggest concerns about implementation. I would say that we're still having a lot of conversations around definition of what a DAC hub is. And I think before we really even talk about implementation, we need to lock that down. I think that we really need to establish as a community, as the government, as Congress, democratic principles around what good DAC looks like in order to be able to distinguish good actors from bad actors. Right now, there's no thermometer for doing that. And the last concern, I think, would just really be truly on the community engagement. I'm glad that DOE is doing their work to ensure that these proposals are including it, but I really don't want it to become a box that companies are checking. Buying land from a landowner is not engagement. And I think when I talk with industry a lot, that's what they are thinking community engagement is. And really, in my heart of hearts, I want people to really understand that environmental justice exists because injustice exists. And I think that we really have to build our capacity as a CDR community to really understand justice issues and acknowledge them before we can really even begin to talk about solutions. So that's my 3.
Well said. And Celina, what are your 3 or 2 or 1 biggest hopes about, like, what could go well? What's good about this? Like, what are you hopeful about?
I am so excited to the point of just like emotionally so about the potential for a public ownership model for at least one of the DAC hubs. What does it look like for a developer not just to engage and consult a community, but to work with the community to jointly own and operate a DAC project that is transparent, that is engaging from start to finish, and that not only sort of asks, is this something that you want, but how can we create it in your vision? And we've been having a lot of really great conversations with communities, with environmental justice groups, with developers on what that might look like. And this is an exciting model, not just for CDR, but I think for climate infrastructure more broadly. And if CDR as this emerging sector can provide not just sort of, best practices for itself, but for all of these other industries that are popping up or that need to accelerate, that is an amazing position for us to be in. And that is just that's what gets me up every morning, is the excitement about sort of changing the paradigm of infrastructure development.
Well said as well. Thank you guys so much. Mega, do you want to come on and ask some audience questions?
Yeah, we do have tons. I think kind of leading on from what you guys were just talking about, what are you most excited about? And you mentioned financial ownership. A couple of people asked, what are the other co-benefits that we can expect to see for communities who do house these DAC hubs? And a couple of people also mentioned specifically, if that carbon dioxide is a useful feedstock, does it make sense for the communities to, sell that on, make it some kind of cooperative model where they benefit from that as well? So what do you think of those ideas and generally the co-benefits of housing one of these?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think there are kind of, two major buckets of benefits that we're thinking about. So first is really labor benefits. I think one of the exciting things about direct air capture is that a lot of the skill sets that it will require in its workforce are transferable from other, heavy industry, and in particular, the fossil fuel sector. And so this is the opportunity to kind of actualize this just transition that we talk about in sort of theoretical terms, but aren't always great at implementing, in part because we are trying to introduce kind of, new forms of jobs and workforce development to communities that have not just sort of existing skill sets, but existing sort of cultural norms and ideas and sort of, identities around certain kinds of work. And so if we can present sort of we talk about sort of, drop-in fuels or things like that, but, drop in like industry and workforce, I think that is a really exciting thing to be able to offer. And because this industry is so new, we can sort of build it from the ground up with unionization and some of these other labor benefits that sectors like renewable energy have traditionally lagged behind in. And the second, we're really thinking about sort of, community benefit agreements. And so this is a binding legal agreement with a project developer that redistributes some of the funds from the project into the community. And so not just for, something that is directly project related, but a community might identify, we're living in a food desert, and what we really need is a grocery store that has, accessible, affordable produce regularly. Or might identify, our schools are underfunded. And so, there should be programming for public schools. So I think these are the kinds of benefits that we're thinking about, because direct air capture, unlike some of the other, CDR pathways, doesn't provide sort of more direct co-benefits like energy production or something like that. And so it is going to be really incumbent on all of us to figure out what some of these auxiliary benefits can be that build out the project to kind of, beyond just its nuts and bolts.
I think that was a great answer. I was really just going to say that I think the benefit of DAC, if we do it right, if we look at this kind of cooperative model, if we look at a community-led and owned model, I think that the benefits are whatever a community needs and wants them to be. And I think that really is the power of DAC if done this way, that, you can build a DAC ecosystem that fills gaps that exist in communities because of, injustices that they're facing, to kind of, enfranchise them in a way to participate in their own kind of democratic leveling of their community.
And quickly to the utilization point, I realize I didn't address that. So we've been conducting workshops in communities to try and understand, community perceptions and needs from projects. And one of the things that we have seen is communities that already have the infrastructure for, say, materials development, cement plants, things like that, are interested in high quality utilization pathways where you're creating long-lived products that are able to kind of, two birds, one stone, right? You're able to kind of remove CO2 in a permanent way, but you're also able to kind of build into some of these other industries. And in communities that don't have those industries already existing, the idea of utilization as sort of a way of building out new industries and, kind of even more, say, truck traffic or sort of like, other potential co-pollutants, these are things that are areas of concern. And so I think it's going to be a very sort of community by community approach, as with all of these things. But one of the things that we have been hearing a lot is, are there ways to sort of, take a DAC hub, plug it into an existing network of industrial activity to clean up that industrial activity and also to provide additional economic opportunities. So yeah, great point.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I mean, kind of on the flip side of things, thinking about, companies like Oxy, which you mentioned, I think their CEO has been sort of interviewed and has said that, she basically thinks that pumping CO2 into the ground is a waste of something valuable and it can be used for enhanced oil recovery. And that's kind of where things need to go. So, that's maybe not shocking, but how do we kind of align those incentives with all the tenants that you guys have put together and make sure that their interests or plans are aligned?
Yeah, I think that this is a really big question, and there's a lot of conversation around the role of the fossil fuel industry and participating in building up the DAC industry, because it is no surprise that they also are the industry that has the most advanced versions of these technologies, because they were already, started the race a little bit before everybody else was able to. And so, of course, I mean, I think it's not surprising, as you said, Mega, that looking from the perspective of an oil company, pumping something into the ground and not getting anything out of it is a waste. But we have to really recognize that pumping the CO2 underground and geologic storage is really the only way we are going to combat the global temperature rise that we really, I think Celina has done a great job of emphasizing in the utilization schemes, that we need to look for long-lived carbon embodied products. And so I think that there is a role for carbon utilization in the replacement of petrochemicals that we use in a lot of other products that are maybe not as long-lived. But I do think that the fossil fuel industry is going to have a reckoning moment with the direct air capture industry and the CDR ecosystem. If it wants to set a precedent moving forward, if it truly wants the trust of communities, it's going to have its reckoning moment with the fossil fuel industry and its participation. I think because the fossil fuel industry is so far ahead and has advanced technology, there is an opportunity for them to really set the groundwork and create, good relationships and set a model for doing this correctly, so they don't become bad actors in the future as they have in the fossil fuel industry. But I think it really, the choice is up to them, because the legislation has not necessarily been tight enough to prevent them from being actors in this space.
And I'll add one more thing. If the fossil fuel industry is really invested in climate solution building, there are two requirements. The first is to rapidly move their production off of the exploration and extraction of additional fossil fuels. The IEA and IPCC are absolutely crystal clear that that is a prerequisite for meeting 1.5 or even 2 degrees. And that in addition to that, we will need carbon removal. And the second is to stop lobbying against climate action in policy circles. If those two criteria are met, we can talk in a good faith way, but I have not seen that progress. And so that makes me skeptical about how good faith their efforts are.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. I think we're just out of time, but that's been amazing. And Toby, I'll leave it to you to close us out.
Yeah. Briefly, I will close things out. But first of all, I really want to thank Simone and Celina for being with us today. And it was really a great discussion. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing. And we at Open Air very much look forward to sustaining and carrying on this conversation. So thanks for being with us. Just a couple of quick, if I can figure this out, show notes. I mentioned in the chat that we are, Open Air is actively working to lobby citizen advocacy for the federal CDRLA and also the state level CDRLA in the states where we are advancing the policy. So that's New York, Colorado, Massachusetts, where it's going to be introduced soon. So we could really use help with this, and it's super easy. We have a corpus of materials that you can just email to your local representatives. So again, please check out that link in the chat and join us. And super excited to announce our next This Is CDR with Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, one of the godmothers of CDR, I would say, and great friend of Open Air. And we're super excited to have her in 2 weeks for a special COP edition of This Is CDR to take a look at where we are with CDR in the US and where it's going to be going between now and 2030. So super excited for that. I put a link in the chat. Please register and join us then. Thank you again to Celina and Simone for being with us. Everyone be well, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.